Well, good day, students. Thanks for joining for this particular lecture on issues related to forgiveness and to reconciliation and restoration. What I want to say at the outset of this particular lecture is this. As a marriage and family therapist, as a pastor, as an educator, as a mediator, and as a person, I can't think of any subject that has received more attention, more airtime than issues of forgiveness. It seems like every day, folks, whatever venue I am in, I find myself explaining, processing, working through, debating about issues of forgiveness with individuals. And I have to conclude, maybe you will too, in light of how you're living your life and where you're at, that it's the biggest show in town. It really is. Not because it's easy to talk about, because it's not. Not because it's fun to talk about, but it's not. But it just is the real deal with lots of individuals. And maybe you personally know of someone either in your immediate sphere of influence of relationships, maybe in an intimate relationship, maybe somebody at work, maybe somebody at family, that they really need to come to terms with what forgiveness is or is not and simply do it. Here's the other part that I want to press into, as I have, I think, with every lecture up to this point. What about you? In other words, it's one thing to take an online class and to jot the stuff down and to process and to write about it, as you will after this lecture. It's another thing to take a look at your own life and say, hey, am I holding somebody hostage with my anger? Am I keeping someone in the penalty box indefinitely and not forgiving them as I should? So anyway, we're back to self-awareness. We're back to please, as you're processing this information, take a look at your own life too, as I have had to a number of times, and quite frankly, even just recently. I find myself engaged in quite a bit of dialogue with people about forgiveness, and a lot of it is to maybe talk people out of what they believe forgiveness is. And it's not memory fatigue. It's not reaching that point where you just don't remember that event ever again. There are a number of people, and you've heard this phrase, and quite frankly, the author of your book, Lewis Smedes, The Art of Forgiving, wrote a companion volume to that, or an earlier volume called Forgive and Forget, and he wishes he hadn't entitled it that, because he never wanted to communicate to anyone this possibility that you reach a point where you actually forget what happened. There are those of us that believe you shouldn't forget what happened. I was speaking about this particular subject at a church not too long ago, and it was interesting. I was building a case. I didn't bring this particular PowerPoint along with me, but I was building a case for the fact that though the scriptures say, God throws our sins into the sea and doesn't recall them, something along that line. I build a case for the fact that it's virtually impossible for us to forget what's happened to us. And in forgetting isn't a part of true forgiveness. Well, this lady came up to me at the end of the talk at the church, and she says, Dr. Rota, I disagree with you. And I said, that's fine. That's fine. What do you disagree with? She says, I disagree with the point that you made that we can actually, uh, that it's impossible to forget what happened to us. And I said, okay, tell me more. And she says, well, um, my husband cheated on me 3 years ago 2 times, and I've forgotten about that. And I only pause, folks, to let you soak in that conversation. Obviously, she hadn't forgotten about it. Now, how we manage that memory is what forgiveness really is, and we'll talk about that. A lot of people believe if they choose to forgive, they're going to be absolving someone of the responsibility of taking care of that whatever happened, a justice issue. Um, that's not true. Forgiveness and justice are two different things. Though you may choose to forgive the person who cheated on you, or choose to forgive the friend who betrayed a confidence or whatever, they'll still have to take responsibility for what they did. This is something that actually scares people about forgiveness, because they believe that if I'm going to forgive you, I'm going to be letting you off the hook. Well, actually, you're not. What you're doing when you choose to forgive someone is you are choosing to let yourself off the hook. And by that, I mean you're choosing to rid yourself of the bitterness and the root of bitterness that we talked about previously. You're not letting that person off the hook. Whatever they did, they'll still have to pay. They'll have to do justice for what happened. Here's an area, too, that down through the years, as I've read and talked and researched about forgiveness, I've really come to believe that it is not an instantaneous event. In other words, I went back and I looked at some of my older teachings on forgiveness. I even went back and I looked at some of my sermons on the subject of forgiveness. And clearly in the scriptures, there's all kinds of evidence for the fact that we need to forgive. That's not a problem. But what I used to do is this. At the end of a service, a church service, for instance, I would say things like, hey, if you've been hurt or betrayed and trust has been broken, today is the day. I mean, it made for great sermons, but it's kind of unrealistic. I would say today's the day that you come forward and you choose today to forgive. And you'll walk out of this church building a new person. I used to use language like that, and then I realized, wait a minute, I don't know their stories. I don't know what it's like, for instance, for a client of mine a number of years ago who was cheated upon by her husband 4 times. 4 times he stepped out of the marriage, and I would be doing her a disservice if in my office I were to say to her, hey, by the time this 50-minute session is over, you will choose to forgive. Well, because of my fundamental belief and even a conviction, folks, that it's not an instantaneous event, what I'm doing is I'm beginning to invite people into a process where, I know it sounds kind of wimpy, but I'm inviting them into a process to begin to think about forgiving. In other words, I'll put forgiveness up there as non-negotiable. I mean, you will need to forgive. That's a given. You can't live the rest of your life this way. When forgiveness is offered, that may be down the road a piece. In fact, probably will. But I don't talk people into forgiving right away and make it an instantaneous event, because it ends up being some pretty inauthentic forgiveness, some unrealistic forgiveness, actually. Maybe not even forgiveness at all. It's certainly not trust. Folks, one of the reasons I had you read The Art of Forgiving by Lewis Smedes is he does probably the best job of anybody that I've read who draws the distinction between forgiveness and trust, and forgiveness and reconciliation or restoration. You can choose, folks, to forgive someone, and I hope you do, but there's not this trust that returns. It's just, it doesn't work that way, and it shouldn't work that way. Now it might, but there's situations where the story is so bizarre, and the hurt is so deep, and the betrayal is so complex, that for me to lock eyes with anybody and say, hey, when you forgive this person for what they did, you will also learn to trust them again. That's just unrealistic, and I don't do that. Let me use this word picture for you all that was given to me by one of my clients years ago. She said, the first time he broke my trust, it's like dropping a vase, and the vase shatters, but for the most part, there's larger pieces laying around. And she said, I picked up the pieces and I glued them back together, and there were a few small pieces missing, but for the most part, it was put back together. But she says, he keeps breaking the vase. He keeps dropping the vase. And she says, I can't put the pieces back together again. And she was trying to figure out, am I supposed to trust this person after he has, dropped the vase so many times? And I said, no, I don't think I ought to talk you into trusting this person, because they're not trustworthy. But you will need to forgive him. And also, it's not restoration, folks. It's again, forgiveness is non-negotiable. It will happen. It needs to happen for your sake. But I will never put restoration and reconciliation in the same conversation, so to speak, with forgiveness, because I don't know. There are times, for instance, when there's been a breach of trust, or there's been some crime committed, where for me to say to that individual, you need to go back and be reconciled to the perpetrator of the crime, that's not being wise. That's not being realistic. People challenge me on this, and that's fine. But I just am not a believer. Clearly, if restoration happens and reconciliation happens as a result of true forgiveness, that's great. But to put restoration in the same sentence as forgiveness, I just won't. I won't do that. I won't do that anymore. One other word picture that, again, I stole from a wonderful book by Philip Yancey and Paul Brand. Actually, it's two books, companion volumes called Fearfully and Wonderfully Made, and the other volume is called In His Image. It's a book actually about the human body, and how A, there must be a creator, and B, how the human body is designed in ways to restore. Well, it's interesting. Dr. Philip Yancey and Paul Brand talk about in this book, in one of the books, about a broken bone. And This is fascinating teaching, and I use this teaching quite a bit. But when there's a bone broken in the body, if that bone sets right, in other words, you put it in a cast or whatever, and it sets right, um, the brokenness. How do I want to say this? The point of the break can and will be actually stronger if you do it right. In other words, if you just rest, relax, if you let the bones heal and set properly, at the point of the break, they'll actually be stronger. Now, my initial reaction is only a good creator would devise something like that, design something like that, where it's actually stronger at the point of the break. But Brand and Yancey go on to point out, but if you keep breaking it, and you keep breaking it, and you keep breaking it, all you have is scar tissue, and it doesn't heal correctly. So, with all this talk about forgiveness, I do want to tell you folks that I have seen situations where, though there's been brokenness and broken trust, they healed correctly, and that couple or that church or whoever is actually stronger today than they were before the break. But I don't necessarily put that up as the norm and say, as a result of this event, as a result of this disastrous event, you'll actually be restored and reconciled and stronger, and trust will return. I just don't do that. But I am telling you, it does happen. And that's why I delight actually in trying as best I can as a mediator, as a therapist, as an educator, to bringing a strategy of healing that makes sense to God and to the people who need to be healed. How do we know when we've forgiven? These points, obviously, you'll see them again as you read through Lewis Smead's The Art of Forgiving. But I get asked this a lot because folks, quite frankly, carry around quite a bit of misunderstanding when it comes to how do I know if I've really forgiven this person. And this first bullet point, is pretty dicey. And let me explain. I don't want to offend any of you taking this class who are in the insurance industry, but let me just tell this story. I got in a car accident a couple of years ago, and 100% not my fault. A guy with his van just ran a stop sign and T-boned me right on the passenger side of my vehicle. Didn't total the vehicle, but I needed to take it in and get it fixed. And then I was reading the report sent back by the insurance company, and I see on there, I can't remember the percentage, but I see on there that 10%, or maybe 5%, I don't know, 10% of that accident was my fault. So I call my insurance buddy, and to protect his identity, I'll call him Jerry because that's his real name. I said, Jerry, what's up with me being partially responsible for this accident? He says, well, were you driving your car? I said, don't get stupid with me. He says, well, were you? And I said, yeah. He says, well, then you're partially responsible. Oh, I said, okay. Now, my rates didn't go up. That's not what I'm saying. But in most situations, folks, that require a certain level of forgiveness, I guess, we probably need to take some responsibility for the offense. I really want to be careful with this, and I wish I could see you face to face, and I wish we could dialogue about this, because there are certain situations, obviously, child abuse, receivers of a crime done against us. Those clearly, I would never dishonor anybody. Say, well, what's your part in all this? I that's just being disrespectful to people when we do that. But in most of our conflicts that require a certain level of forgiveness, we will know that we're on the right path of forgiveness when we've taken some responsibility for what happened. And again, I go into that teaching lightly, but even in my office, when I'm dealing with folks where there's been broken trust in the marriage, I will always make sure they understand that the person who broke the trust, she shouldn't have done what she did. She shouldn't have stepped out of the marriage. And yet there are reasons why people do what they do. And there may be some responsibility for that. In other words, in the case that I'm thinking about right now, for the woman who stepped out of the marriage, the husband eventually said, come to think of it, I really have paid too much attention to my business, or I've been too involved in lots of other things, and I should have paid more attention to my business. I'm not going to let her off the hook for what she did. I will forgive her. But as I think this through, I'm partially responsible for the mess we're in. Second one, people, when they're really, really hurt, see that person as, no, that's not how I want to say it. That person gets defined by what they did rather than who they are. We'll know that we're beginning to forgive someone when we don't necessarily or ever agree with what they did, but we begin to understand that they're human, that they make mistakes. Again, we don't like the mistake they made. We're probably on the receiving end of the mistake they made. But that person has a story. We may not even give a rip about what that story is. But when we've seen a real person behind the hurt, then we're on our way, I think, to forgiving someone. When we've surrendered our right to get even, and let's be honest, all of us, our default is burn, baby, burn. Our default is to figure out how to get even with this person. A lot of times when I'm working with folks on the front end of some broken trust or some potential forgiveness down the road, I actually have to really help them monitor their behaviors right on the front end of the offense, because by default, we want to get even. And I wish it weren't that way, but come on, it is. That's kind of how we roll. So when we've surrendered our right to get even, we're on the way to forgiveness. When the offense is no longer the trump card in arguments, again, go back to the whole forgiveness piece. Forgetting piece. We'll never forget that. And I'm really clear to point that out to folks, is you'll always remember what happened to you. But if what happened to you is the trump card, 14 years later in an argument that you're having with somebody, say, well, at least I didn't get the DWI or whatever. When the offense is no longer leverage in an argument, again, I don't ask people to forget it, but as I point out to them, when whatever happened is no longer the trump card in arguments, you're on your way. This last one is supernatural. I mean, really, come on. When we wish good for the person who hurt us, I just about put this one in brackets, folks, because I don't necessarily see this as non-negotiable. I have seen people exercise true forgiveness, but they don't. Uh, they're not at the point where they really want a whole bunch of good to happen to the person that hurt them. In fact, tolerating them is the best that they can do. So I probably would put this in brackets if I were doing it over again, saying, if there is a point where you actually wish good for the person who hurt you, that's almost a divine place. That's almost a sacred place. That's a place that only God Himself could help you get to, because none of us, on our own strength, ever want to wish good for the person who hurt us. I don't care what the hurt is. It's often difficult, almost impossible, to wish good for that person. But if God is in the forgiveness, and there seems to be a greater work of God going on in this forgiveness, then it really is possible to wish good for the person who hurt us. Well, that's it. Again, part of the pushback of online is I wish I could hear your stories. I wish I could hear your questions. But as you write your paper on forgiveness, you'll get a chance to dip into some of this teaching, to write about it. But again, if you have questions or you want to be resourced further in areas of forgiveness, let me know. God bless you, folks. Thanks.